It's time for football. In particular, it's time for a very nostalgic and very special footy game. It's on the Amiga, it goes like the clappers, it's got tiny little sprites, but it's not sensible soccer. It's Football Glory. Funnily enough, Football Glory was actually one of the very first games covered on this channel way back in 2012, the Mega Wii Views days. So seeing as how that video's almost old enough to start developing acne and falling out with its parents, I thought it was about time to have a proper look at this game and the story behind it. On the one hand, Football Glory is a game that looks, on the surface, to be a rather shameless rip-off. On the other hand, playing it actually reveals a lot of differences and additions to the classic Sensi formula that makes playing the game a pretty fresh experience. And then, on the other hand, it's the first game by a studio from a country with basically no commercial gaming history, and said studio would go on to much bigger and greater things. There's a lot to uncover then with this simple game. So let's kick it back to 1994 and give this classic a go. The best way to get going here is with the company that published Football Glory, a bunch of guys called Black Legend, one of the few Amiga companies with a logo that could out-prog rock Psygnosis. Formed in Switzerland in 1992 before joining up with UK distributors Compart and moving to St Albans in 1993 followed by Welwyn Garden City, Black Legend were, in the grand scheme of things, a late arrival to the Amiga scene. Now sure, if you were simply a customer back in 1992, you may have thought that everything on the Amiga was just great. Look, there's new computers hitting the shelves, there's plenty of games coming out, we've got bundles out the arse, Amiga magazines are absolutely jam-packed. On the inside, however, 1992 is where, gradually, more and more companies are seeing the writing on the wall. PCs are making massive inroads, and Commodore isn't providing any competition for that. If that doesn't change, and obviously it won't, then things long term look pretty bleak. But it's here where Black Legend come in, and they do so with a pretty new angle. Compart had a lot of outposts dotted around Europe, and the aim of the partnership with Black Legend was to work with smaller European studios, a lot of whom came from former Soviet bloc countries as well as Scandinavia, where there was a nascent and untapped scene for computers like the Amiga, with flourishing demo scenes and a hell of a lot of potential. Rather than being moved over to the UK, these coders would still be working in their home countries, and there was a bit more of a laid-back approach when it came to things such as deadlines and what have you. A fair number of the coders who worked with Compart and Black Legend were part-timers. Black Legend's first games do indeed show a lot of potential. Other than Football Glory, the main game I knew them for back in the day is a Euro platformer called Fat Man the Caped Consumer, a rather silly title produced by a Hungarian studio named IO Product. The game here in the main is a fairly standard collect 'em up, but the premise is enjoyably comedic, the music is cracking, and the gameplay's okay enough. Not the best, but I have a real soft spot for it. Other less inspiring releases include Moscow Nights, an MS-DOS compilation of what is, by and large, a bunch of Russian games that aren't anywhere near the level of Tetris, although the compilation does include Drop Drop, which is the original version of a game that would be licensed by Data East and, in their hands, become the all-time classic puzzler Magical Drop. Other earlier titles by them include Hyperion, a 3D shooter from Norwegian developers Offense Studios. While this is pretty much a Zarch clone, it's not exactly a bad one, especially if you're not utterly awful at Zarch or games like it, like I am. A bit more original is Statics, from German studio Seventh Sign. This is another match-3 type game, although you also have to use the blocks to balance out a seesaw, which does add a nice dimension when it comes to actually constructing the well. Simple, but chilled out and with some excellent music as well. There's also Crystal Dragon, a fine-looking and typically tough dungeon crawling RPG by the excellent Magnetic Fields. There's a compilation of simpler games from Hungary, and the odd title that never ended up coming out. Flower, for the Love of the World Enchanted Road, was a Rodland-esque cutesy platformer that didn't quite make it, although a demo of it does exist, and the shoot-em-up Shenandoah Daughter of the Stars was absolutely raved about in mags and the like by anyone who'd seen it before it entered development hell. Happily, this game did finally arrive on PC in 2016 under the title 1993 Space Machine, with a PS4 release under the Shenandoah name happening in 2023. There's a good few intriguing Black Legend titles out there, and it didn't take long for them to start getting a fair bit of attention. They were quick to establish relationships with the Amiga press and get their opinions out there, and they were also pretty keen to provide the mags with cover disc material. Soon enough they were in most magazines' good books. Still, despite the rather unique angle they had, the post-Soviet studios and all of that, they would inevitably have most of their success with football. After all, football is kin on the Amiga. Thanks to Kickoff, and particularly thanks to Sensible Soccer, football basically ends up being the main thing most people want on the computer. Not just regular old football, but football management as well. Back in the Worst Amiga Power Games vid, we saw Steve McGill bemoan that even the absolute laziest and worst games out there were bound to shift at least a few units simply because they had football or soccer in the title. Black Legend's first tilt at this big market came in the shape of the UK-developed Tactical Manager 1 and 2. While these aren't exactly the best-looking football management games out there, they did do quite well due to featuring a pretty strong multiplayer component, with space for over 40 human-controlled managers taking turns in the hot seat. And as for the second, more action-packed football game, well, that's the one we're covering, and it's going to introduce us to about half a dozen demo scene lads from Croatia who've decided to form their own little studio. Croteam was officially formed by a quartet of people in August 1992, all of whom were located in the Utrina suburb of Zagreb in Croatia. Roman Ribaric, Davor Honski, Dean Sekulic and Damir Perovic, a group of friends who'd all gone to the same high school and were involved in coding, making various non-commercial games for platforms like the Spectrum and then the Amiga, pretty much just for the fun of it. When Black Legend put the word out around Eastern Europe that they were looking for developers, they quickly ended up getting in touch and the Croteam team was soon doubled. Alan Ladovac, Tomislav Pongrac, Admir Elizovic and Marko Sekulic all joined the Croteam project from the country's demo scene. Officially, Croatia was obviously a pretty new country at the time. They declared independence from Yugoslavia in 1991, a move which soon led to a war that would last for 4 years, ending in August of 95. Naturally, at this stage, Croatia didn't have any history at all when it came to commercial games publishing. And as we'll see, the people at Croteam took it upon themselves not just to become the first Croatian studio to release a game in Europe, but to help other groups do the same, bringing them under the Black Legend win. For now though, the subject of their first big computer game had a pretty easy inspiration. Football was, and indeed still remains, a big passion for Croteam, something that they loved to watch and also loved to play. To this day you're still likely to find Croteam folks on the pitch as you are anywhere else, especially if there's some sort of games industry tournament happening. What to say then about this first game, this football title? Well, Football Glory eventually hit the shelves in November of 1994, but not before a big flurry of press announcing not just this title, but other games that were going to come out under the Croteam banner, a combat flight sim called Embryo, a top-down shooter called Spherical Worlds, and a first-person dungeon crawler named Evil's Doom, the latter of which would unfortunately never end up getting released. Football Glory was the first game up to the plate, and the game's previews quickly went to the topic of its similarity to Sensi, especially in the one where Black Legend boss Richard Holmes was certainly questioned over it. Holmes's defence was that the guys at Croteam hadn't played Sensible Soccer. He said that they looked similar mainly because the game was using 16 by 16 pixel sprites as opposed to 32 by 32, and that no one had copyright on the size of a little man. If they had, then Sensible Software would have been sued by the makers of Lemmings. Other than this, the preview's full of lots of claims of just what people are going to see in Football Glory. A whole load of movements and techniques that were inspired by watching Brazil in action at the World Cup, realistic calculations when it comes to how the ball reacts when it does things like hit the post, not to mention rather outlandish situations such as pitch invasions happening and what have you. It all sounds quite wild, to be honest, but over the course of Football Glory and its later sequel, the majority of what Holmes says in the preview would end up appearing. Even if Football Glory may have looked similar to another, much more famous title, it ended up doing a lot of things differently, and it did a lot of things damn well. So once you get into the game and decide which of the usual flavours of football you want, whether you want a regular old friendly, 1 or 2 players, clubs or nations, a tournament or a league or whatever, the question is, does the game actually play like Sensible Soccer? And the answer is that no, it really doesn't. Football Glory plays an even faster and a much more chaotic game of football. Hell, it's so chaotic that it's actually quite on brand with Croteam's later releases. The passing is like a bullet, the ball can go from one end to the other in all of a few seconds, and that's just before you get to all the things that the game adds in. If you were to play this back to back with the much more measured Sensible Soccer, you wouldn't find a lot of similarities beyond the looks, and it's not as if Sensi's a slouch. Running can also be quite key in Football Glory. You do at times get a big old boost of speed that allows you to blitz past the defences in no time flat, and while you don't necessarily need that in order to make your way past the backlines, which in all honesty are a fair bit stupider than they are in Sensi, it is certainly effective and can even allow you to run past the keeper. Pretty much everything here is focused on attack. You can put an absolute ton of aftertouch on the ball, which while it may not be the most natural implementation, seeing as you can do it basically whenever you want, is pretty handy when it comes to fooling the keeper and sending him the wrong way. And then there's all the extra techniques. Diving headers are here of course, but there's also bicycle kicks, volleys, jumping a tackle, rapid 1-2 passing. There's a lot to be getting on with. In practice, all of this means that Football Glory is all about goals. Lots of goals. As already mentioned, the CPU's defense isn't exactly the brightest around, so once you get handy with the controls, you'll be hitting the back of the onion bag a ton. However, the CPU is pretty effective in attack as well, and more than capable of pulling off all the banana shots and overhead kicks that you can, so you'll likely be letting a good few goals in yourself. It isn't uncommon for a 5 minutes per half match to feature around 15 to, hell, even 20 goals. Even if things go drastically wrong and you end up 6 goals behind or whatever, you still may have a half decent chance of pulling the whole game back if you're able to improve your attacking play. Now, are these rugby-esque scorelines in any way realistic? Well, obviously not, but it sure is fun. If there's one area where Football Glory does absolutely lord it over Sensi, it is here in the attacking play. I find that with this game there's a lot more ways to score, even without using the bicycle kicks or whatever. You can be very creative with your shots, it feels quite satisfying when you properly fool the keeper, and it's especially satisfying when you crash a shot in off the post. Again, the ball reacts off the post much more wildly and variedly to how it does in Sensi, where it usually just comes straight off at a 90-degree angle. And you always get a zoomed in, slow motion, picture-in-picture replay of your goal, complete with a shout of "Magnificent goal!" if you've scored a right belter. At least that's what you get if you're playing the game on an A1200. Playing against the computer in Football Glory, for the most part, is never not highly entertaining, with matches full of ups and downs and near enough constant action. And obviously it's even better when you're playing with a friend.
Magnificent goal!
With all of this does come a whole batch of weirdness, not all of which necessarily may be to everybody's taste, but I did mention that this game is a chaotic one that, in retrospect, is exactly the sort of football game you would expect Croteam to make, even if it is their first game. Beyond the little men and the similarities to Sensi that brings, there's quite a lot of flair in the graphics, and especially a lot of flair in the animation. I always like how the pitch gradually gets more and more pockmarked with dirt slides from tackles as the match goes on, and the game fits in a ton of extra animation for all of its moves, as well as the dribbling, all the celebrations and that. And yes, some of this animation isn't necessarily in service of the game. You do get a fair bit of comedy in Football Glory. There's always a ref on the pitch, and he usually has something to say about bad tackles. If he sends someone off, there'll be a spot of dialogue, and at times the offending player may well have a chance to vainly chase after the ref for a few seconds. Injuries will bring about either a doctor complete with magic spray, or a couple of orderlies to stretcher the poor sod off if it's particularly bad, as well as more dialogue. And then there's the thoroughly random, completely out there occurrences. You may well get a pitch invasion courtesy of a streaker, a protester, or a canine. Some people did complain a bit about these things happening, and that it was just a completely pointless stoppage of the game, although honestly these pitch invasions are very rare. In all the time that I've played Football Glory, I've only seen them occur a couple of times. Perhaps the most chaotic thing of all is that sometimes the computer will just flat out give you a goal. The keeper will make an absolutely ludicrous mistake and end up twatting the ball into his own net, at which point there'll be more amusing text to mark the occasion. This is just the sort of thing that happens with this game. It is certainly quite crude in this regard, although often these stupid goals don't make an awful lot of difference to a match's outcome because the scorelines end up being so high. Now, I must say that I absolutely love Football Glory. On the whole, is it better than Sensi? Well, no, perhaps not. It's certainly incredible as an offensive package, but Sensible Soccer is the more balanced title and quite clearly the more influential game. Is it the best slice of football action that you can get on the Amiga outside of Sensible Soccer? Well, the answer to that for me is yes. There are a lot of other really good footy games on the Amiga, some of which are more inspired by Sensi than others, the likes of Empire Soccer 94 and Sierra Soccer that will give you 90 rock-solid virtual minutes, but for me, Football Glory is the definite number 2. Some of that may have to do with nostalgia and actually owning the title back in the day, but this game still holds up superbly whenever I boot it up now. It's one of the best footy games for a quick match because it's a dead cert that lots of stuff is bound to happen, and it does come with a whole load of very pretty graphics and animation. I love this game dearly, and it certainly makes for a fine alternative to Sensi. Croteam absolutely nailed it. It's not totally flawless. The referee can be an annoyingly harsh git, and it can be very easy to accidentally sizzle the living hell out of an opposing player, and in particular the goalkeeper, which results in an automatic red card. And I am sure for some people this game may just be too chaotic a representation of football, especially with all the moments where it's trying to be funny. But a lot of the time, this is exactly the sort of eventful, if not necessarily realistic, footy experience that I'm looking for. It is stonking arcade stuff. The reviews for Football Glory were a little bit of a mixed bag, ranging from the outrageously effusive to the much more critical. It is perhaps no surprise that CU Amiga and Amiga Action gave it the best reviews, with CU Amiga in particular giving it the quite frankly ridiculous mark of 95%, for a review that was naturally both an exclusive and then proudly displayed on the game's box. Now, as much as I love Football Glory, I do think that this is a pretty extreme score. I would say that this is the definition of a damn fine mid-high 80s game, one that's certainly recommended, but not a 95% score that you would reserve for an all-time great. Now, as mentioned before, Black Legend did foster a pretty good relationship with the magazines, and you do wonder if a part of that resulted in this staggering score, as well as the 90% it got from Amiga Action. Not that it matters so much, seeing as the game is pretty damn good. Amiga format were very positive with an 80%, the One were iffier with 74, and Amiga Power were quite harsh with a 66. It is worth keeping in mind that Football Glory did have the toughest competition possible. It was released at virtually the same time as Sensible World of Soccer, just about the most hotly anticipated game on the platform, and a sequel that most mags would end up treating as the best title the Amiga had ever seen. However, even with this competition, Football Glory was still able to sell strongly, placing very high in the monthly charts. Indeed, it sold more than enough for Sensible Software to clearly think that the game was a serious threat, and that Football Glory was very blatantly making a big yellow mark on its territory. John Hare and company were vocally highly unhappy about Football Glory, deeming the game to be a clone that was trying to profit off of what Sensi had created. Much like the more critical reviewers of the game, the likes of The One's Simon Byron and AP's Paul Mellowick, they clearly weren't convinced about Richard Holmes's claims that Croteam had never played Sensible Soccer before, and in the end Sensi and Renegade were able to, at least temporarily, get Football Glory pulled from shelves with the threat of legal action. Judging by the charts, this likely happened around about the summer of '95. While this was indeed only for a short time, it was enough for Football Glory sales to take a bit of a knock. That said, the knock wasn't necessarily as big as some claimed. it, as well as Black Legend's other footy-based title, Tactical Manager, were the company's best ever selling products, which, judging by estimates in David Quix's feature on the company in the 196th issue of Retro Gamer, meant that Football Glory was good for sales probably in the 80 to 100,000 range over both its Amiga and PC-DOS releases. Later on in 1995, with Sensi's claims presumably unable to stand up to legal scrutiny, the game did get to re-release through Ocean on the Hit Squad label, and it was eventually released as freeware by Croteam in 1998. Anyway, we're not finished yet. We do still have a sequel to look at, as well as seeing just what else Black Legend and Croteam got up to. By this time, Black Legend also had an outpost in Germany, as well as a burgeoning partnership with Croteam that would, despite being so late on in the Amiga's commercial years, result in a good few games from other Croatian studios. Previously we mentioned Embryo and Spherical Worlds, and while these games weren't directly released by Croteam, they were made by other Croatian studios. Embryo was made by a group called Beyond Arts, Spherical Worlds was made by Formatted, and they came out in 1994 and 1996 respectively. Black Legend were also still very much looking for other studios from former Soviet bloc countries. Two other games that they published would be a duo of titles that are known to those who tried ever so valiantly to get a taste of that PC Doom magic on their humble Amiga. Those games are Behind the Iron Gate and Citadel, both of which hailed from Poland and were released in 1995. Ego's Behind the Iron Gate is... one of the weakest attempts. It's such a bare title that you'll probably end up getting lost in seconds, and the control system is absolutely maddening. Conversely, Virtual Design's Citadel is one of the better ones. It's not without faults, but it plays a hell of a lot better. You would need a beast of an Amiga for the game to be playable at any size larger than a postage stamp, mind you. That said, it's something for this game to actually be capable of running at all on something like an A500, even if it is tiny there. Also, this is a game where running into the walls hurts you, so watch out for that. Unfortunately, Black Legend couldn't do a whole lot about time and motion. As we hit 1996, things are very clearly coming to an end on the Amiga. In Retro Gamer, Richard Holmes observed that with every gaming expo, less and less companies were joining them in peddling Amiga wares, and they weren't exactly kitted out for the move to 3D, the PlayStation and what have you. And so the decision was made to close Black Legend, although their German outpost did last a few months longer before shutting up shop, and it's here where we get Croteam's sequel to Football Glory. Back in the one's preview of the original, Holmes said that the game would feature an indoor mode. That didn't happen, but only because said indoor mode would eventually become a whole other game called Five-A-Side Soccer that was initially released in Germany only and eventually made free in 2000. This game is surely right up my street. You've got all the chaos of Football Glory, but now it's indoors, complete with all manner of walls to bounce balls off? Yeah, clearly this game is a no-brainer. Now sure, it's little more than Football Glory with walls, a bunch more extra animations, and some of the sillier ones taken out. No chasing the ref this time, I'm afraid. But, well, it's Football Glory but with walls. Rather than different seasons, you can pick different courts to play the match on that will affect the ball's bounce and so on. Parquet, clay, grass, astroturf and what have you. And the game certainly takes things seriously, with different wall sets available and the like. While there had been indoor football modes in games before, this is definitely a bit more in-depth, and there's certainly a marked difference in the quality of some of the teams as well, more so than there is in Football Glory, I reckon. While I would still pick the original game over this one, Five-A-Side Soccer is a very nice take on the formula, and there's not a whole lot else like it on the Amiga. As someone who generally loves indoor football modes, it's right up my alley. After this, as far as people outside of Croatia went, Croteam went quiet. If you didn't know any better, you may have thought for a while that they were lost to time, one of many Amiga developers that came about in the computer's later days, released a couple of games, and then disappeared. If you were in Croatia, however, you may well have seen their work on television. They spent some time developing a game called Save the Earth, a game in the Hugo Joe Raz vein that is actually, technically, their first 3D title. There is unfortunately no way to play this game, although there is footage available of it on YouTube, taken from the kids' TV show Turbo Limac, or Limac or whatever. And aside from that, well, Croteam weren't gone at all. They were in the woodshed, and in 2001 they would show the fruits of their labours to the whole world. Now, Serious Sam is obviously a classic, an utterly brilliant and thoroughly arcade-minded first-person shooter, something that was even considered something of a throwback in 2001, chock full of personality and bristling with action. It is a pretty damn important game too, not just because it paved the way for so many other first-person titles in this vein with its arenas filled with crowds of enemies and all that, you know, the ones that get classified under the dreaded term boomer shooter nowadays. It's important because it and the Serious engine also flew the flag for independent 3D games development in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe. It showed that if you had the skill and the creativity without necessarily having the money, you could build an engine for this sort of game yourself, as opposed to shelling out millions of dollars for a licensed one. And the early 2000s saw plenty other developers pop up around Europe with the same ideas, ready to break their own new grounds. PC Mag cites the likes of Crytek and CD Projekt Red as being amongst this lot, and Croteam were one of the first European indies to put out a brilliant 3D game like this, show that it was possible to give the major studios a bloody nose whilst on a budget, and rightly earn a whole load of success. It really paved the way. Without their early work, all of this likely doesn't happen. Not just Football Glory, but the partnership with Black Legend that pretty much single-handedly created the games industry in Croatia. They've certainly never forgotten the title. It's been available as freeware for a long time, there's a Football Glory themed Easter egg in the 4th Serious Sam game, and the studio have even proclaimed that their most recent title, the Talos Principle 2, is actually a spiritual successor to Football Glory. Now, okay, that last one might possibly be a little tongue-in-cheek, but clearly it is still a title that they're fond of. And while it might be unlikely that we ever see a Football Glory HD, Football Glory 4K or anything like that, it's hard to fully discount that because Croteam are, after all, one of those studios that tend to surprise you with the directions that they go in. It is hard to say much bad about them, and it all started with an Amiga footy game that, even if it may well have been considered quite similar to a much bigger title, still had plenty to offer. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.